The 48 Laws of Power, written by Robert Greene. Introduction. What does it mean to me? Learn about the background, inner workings, and secrets of power. We humans, whether we like it or not, are born into a constant game, the game of power. Every single one of us is a player in the game that has existed since the beginning of time, whether knowingly or unknowingly. The game can occasionally be graphic and bloody. But more often than not, it is subtly played and done in the background. Are you playing to win, and are you aware of the rules? Some choose to ignore it, fooling themselves into thinking that we can choose to not participate in the game of power. Alternately, they might object by claiming that the game is evil and antisocial, a holdover from less moral and democratic times. The game-loving players can easily dominate these players. Others seem to be natural adepts, dominating without even trying, like ruthless bullies on the playground or charismatic business titans. But the odds are not in their favor in this game. Anyone who studies the game and plays it well will be able to learn and master their skills. Robert Greene uses historical illustrations from cultures around the world, drawing on 3,000 years of history, to lay out the game's rules in the 48 Laws of Power. In order to help you outplay your opponents and develop into a master player, a modern-day Machiavelli, he distills the wisdom of master manipulators. We'll condense 12 of the book's 48 laws in this summary to give you a glimpse, a first taste, of power. After all, we wouldn't want to reveal every detail, would we? You'll learn in this summary how a beginner's mistake can help you win big. The reasons behind the imprisonment of a finance minister for throwing a lavish party for his king. On occasion, giving up the fight is your best option for victory. Lesson 1. Don't surpass the expert. Have you ever made an attempt to impress your boss but failed miserably? You might have unintentionally broken the first rule of the game of power, according to Greene, which is to never outshine the master. The first law of power states that we must appear modest in front of those who are more powerful than us. After all, influential people like to command attention. When you try too hard to impress someone, you risk damaging their pride by diverting attention from them and onto you. Acting superior to them is even worse because it could make your boss believe that you are a threat to their position. If this happens, they might try to fire you entirely, and they probably will. Consider the bond that existed between France's King Louis XIV and his finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet established himself as a wise and dependable advisor, but this did not make him the prime minister in the event that the incumbent minister passed away. Fouquet, who was well connected and influential, threw a lavish party at his lavishly decorated chateau to win the king's favor. Fouquet was detained by the king the following day. Being overshadowed, Louis XIV charged the minister with stealing in order to amass such extravagant wealth. The validity of the charge was unimportant. In a cell, Fouquet spent the rest of his life. Now that you know, try to avoid acting extravagantly or showing off your intellectual prowess in front of your boss. The opposite is true. So how do you win someone's favor? A better tactic would be to consistently elevate the status of the person in charge relative to everyone else, including yourself. Galileo Galilei is a good example. He came up with a brilliant way to get the money he so desperately needed for his research. He had pleaded with different patrons for money for years, but he had always received gifts rather than the required funds. Therefore, when he found the 4 moons of Jupiter in 1610, he chose to concentrate on one family, the Medicis. Cosimo II de' Medici had recently made Jupiter the emblem of the Medici family. Galileo declared the discovery of Jupiter's 4 moons to be a cosmic event heralding the Medici family's ascendancy by connecting it to Cosimo II de' Medici's coronation. He claimed that Cosimo I, the father of the 4 Medici brothers, was represented by Jupiter, while the 4 moons stood in for Cosimo II and his 3 brothers. This stroked his patron's ego, who saw it as a divine sign affirming the family's greatness. Galileo earned a salary as the official philosopher and mathematician of Cosimo II by making the Medici family seem illustrious and associating their name with the cosmos. He never had to ask anyone for money again. Lesson 2. Be sure to protect your own work while acknowledging other people's. Would you ever think about stealing a few clever passages from someone else's writing and passing them off as your own? Have you ever subtly taken another student's math test answers? Whether you did or did not, the fact remains that gaining power frequently entails utilizing the efforts of others for your own gain. Why exert yourself when someone else is willing to do it for you? Did you know that Thomas Edison's famed employee Nikola Tesla was a Serbian scientist? And by refining Edison's rather crude design, Tesla, and not Edison, played a crucial part in the development of Edison's renowned dynamo? In the lab, Tesla frequently put in 18-hour days for the entire year it took to make this discovery. The dynamo is now, however, credited to Edison. Not much has changed. Consider how few politicians actually write their own speeches and how much renowned novelists actually borrow from other authors. However, simply benefiting from other people's labor is insufficient, you also need to claim credit for it. Tesla's work on the dynamo was largely credited to Edison and his business. Despite having promised Tesla $50,000, Edison didn't give Tesla even a single cent of his profits. So, keep in mind Tesla's lessons learned and keep in mind that the credit given for any kind of creation is just as important as the creation itself. Someone else will step in, steal your idea, and take all the credit if you don't claim it. Lesson 3. Getting to know someone, and pretending to be their friend, is the key to gaining control over them. You're trying to outmaneuver the competition, but you can't quite manage to predict their strategies with enough accuracy. Perhaps you've run into this issue before. How do you circumvent this? Getting crucial information about the people you want to control is another method for gaining power. You must also be aware of someone in order to obtain something from them. After all, you can influence someone's behavior and win their favor by being aware of their plans, weaknesses, and desires. Consider the art dealer Joseph Devine, who made it his goal to represent Andrew Mellon in 1920. Mellon, however, was not easily persuaded, so Devine made the decision to pay Mellon's employees to divulge information to him about their employer. Devine made certain to accompany Mellon on his trip to London. Supposedly by accident, Devine appeared at the same art gallery Mellon was visiting and struck up a lively conversation with him. Devine easily won Mellon's favor by leading him to believe that they shared similar tastes in art, among other things, because he was so familiar with what Mellon liked. The meeting ended happily, and Mellon quickly established himself as Devine's top customer. So how do you execute Devine's ruse? Hire informants, or even better, pose as someone's friend and act as your own spy. Even though hired spies are the preferred option, this tactic is dangerous. How can you be certain that your spies are being truthful with you, after all? It's best to conduct your own surveillance in order to ensure the accuracy of your information. Since most people are reluctant to disclose private information to strangers, this is not an easy task. Posing as a companion is a highly successful tactic because they are less secretive when with someone they consider a friend. Lesson 4. Be unpredictable to confound your rivals. Although you probably already know that most people dislike abrupt changes, did you also know that you could benefit from unpredictability in a competitive environment? Being unpredictable can throw your rivals off guard. How? Read on. In competitive situations, your rivals will probably make a concerted effort to understand you by observing your habits and decision-making, and they won't think twice to use this knowledge against you. Your best course of action in this scenario is to behave erratically. Being unpredictable will keep your adversaries from understanding you, which will frighten and intimidate them. Consider the renowned chess game between Bobby Fischer and Russian champion Boris Spassky in 1972. Fischer took advantage of the knowledge that Spassky's strategy involved attacking his opponent's habits and predictability by playing as unpredictably as he could. Even in the days before the game, Fischer seemed unsure of his ability to travel to Reykjavik, where the two were scheduled to play. And when he finally showed up, it was just before the match was going to be called off because of his absence. Following this prank, Fischer started complaining about everything in the room, including the lighting, the chairs, and the noise. When the first match finally started, Fischer made careless errors before giving up, an odd choice considering his reputation for perseverance. Spassky was unable to determine whether he was in fact making errors or merely bluffing. Spassky was now exactly where Fischer wanted him. When your rival is sufficiently perplexed, you are in an excellent position to triumph. Why? Your opponent will try to understand your actions, which will divert him from the task at hand and give you the opportunity to strike. Fischer started making risky moves to win chess games after 2 matches. Spassky gave in, so Fischer was declared the new world champion. Lesson 5. It will be easier for you to gain power later if you give in to a stronger adversary. Have you ever gone up against someone you knew you couldn't defeat? People frequently struggle for glory against all difficulties, but this is not the path to power. So what should you do when up against a stronger foe? Giving up. Given that people battle their enemy out of impulse to defend themselves, this approach might appear unusual. However, if a rival acts aggressively, he will anticipate a similar response from you. Your best course of action is to give up when you are aware that the opposition has you beat. Why? You can guarantee that your adversary won't deal significant damage if you surrender, or at the very least, make him believe that you have. Not only that, but your adversary will likewise let down his guard after believing he has won. When he does, You'll have a fantastic chance to gather your strength and formulate your next course of action. Consider Bertolt Brecht, a socialist revolutionary writer who emigrated to the United States in 1941 to join other intellectuals who had been driven from their homes in Europe. Brecht and his contemporaries were called before the U.S. Congress after World War II as part of an inquiry into alleged communist infiltration of Hollywood. Brecht was composed and courteously responded to the questions that were put to him, in contrast to his fellow radicals who created a ruckus and attacked the legitimacy of Congress by shouting and acting uncooperatively. Brecht was granted freedom by the government for his excellent behavior, and they even offered to assist him with his immigration process. Their offer was ultimately immaterial because he left the nation and carried on writing about his staunch communist views. And his obstinate pals? They were barred from publishing for years because of this. So follow Brecht's example and use surrender as a tool for empowerment. Invest in long-term strength as opposed to making significant sacrifices for a fleeting moment of glory. Lesson 6. You must behave like a superior if you want to be respected. Are you at the top of the ladder compared to others? If so, it's imperative that you portray that person, unless, of course, you desire to be viewed as equal to them. But heed this, pretending to be on an equal footing with those below you while occupying a superior position will only breed contempt. Consider Louis Philippe, who ruled France between the years 1830 and 1840. He detested any throne-related symbolism and ceremonial events. He was notorious for disobeying the formality expected of his position by donning a grey hat and brandishing an umbrella in place of his crown and scepter. He didn't even socialize with the aristocracy, he largely made friends with bankers. However, the king's actions did him no favors. He quickly gained the enmity of both the wealthy and the poor. The poor resented a monarch who behaved like the lower classes but didn't look out for them, while the rich disliked the improbable ruler. The moment his banking pals realized they could insult him without consequence, they turned against him. All of this animosity increased until the populace rose up against him, forcing him to leave the throne. Acting modestly makes others suspect you are dishonest because they will think your modest methods are a sneaky ploy to obscure your privileges. In general, people are skeptical of higher-ups who act like their equals. So what would be a better strategy? Instead, you should employ the crown's method to command respect from others. Simply said, if you act as though you are superior to others and believe that you are, others will start to think the same way about you. They'll presume you have a valid excuse for acting in this way. Because of the way Christopher Columbus conducted himself, most people thought of him as royalty. In actuality, it was his assured courtship of the Spanish royal family that persuaded the Spanish throne to support his travels. Lesson 7. To exert control over others, seduction is preferable to compulsion. Imagine that you are Chuko Liang, the state of Shu's chief strategist in ancient China. King Mengguo has just launched war on China from the south. It is up to you to stop him and preserve the nation. But it's important to understand what you shouldn't do first before understanding what you should. First of all, even though it's the simplest option, utilizing force and coercive tactics is never a good idea. People will subconsciously dislike you if you employ force because force begets opposition. Despite the fact that Liang would have likely defeated the advancing army, he was aware of this and chose not to strike. But if he had, Mengguo would have hated both China and Liang, and the nation would have had to defend itself constantly. Everyone involved would have been worn out and paranoid as a result of this. Seduction is a more effective tactic. People can often be made to do things against their will by manipulating their emotions, which is how they are usually controlled. You can achieve this by frightening your adversary with harm and then unexpectedly showing them kindness. Liang took Mengguo and his entire army when he attacked China. Mengguo was cut off from his troops. His expectations were low. Instead, he was presented with delectable food and drink, much to his great surprise. While Liang freed his adversary's warriors, he insisted that he would only release Mengguo after receiving a guarantee from the adversary's monarch that, should he ever be arrested again, he would submit to the Chinese king. Liang continued to capture Mengguo, but each time he released him. Then, after his seventh capture, Mengguo knelt at Liang's feet and gave over control of his realm. Mengguo was capable of being murdered by Liang, something that his adversary was well aware of, but Liang gave him numerous opportunities and treated him well each time. As a result, Mengguo became more and more appreciative of and reliant upon the Chinese king until he at last submitted of his own accord. Lesson 8. Avoid your friends and work with your adversaries in your drive for power. It's only natural to want to enlist your pals when you find yourself in a challenging work circumstance. After all, a sympathetic friend is the best person to lessen the pain of a business tragedy. Honestly, anyone can complete it. Putting your faith in your pals is a big mistake. The explanation is straightforward. Your friends would probably compare themselves to you and, as a result, be jealous of what you have. The best course of action is to put some distance between you and them as a result. Their closest associates, many of whom they had appointed as generals, frequently killed the Chinese emperors. Emperor Sung adopted a different strategy after seeing its perilous potential. He skillfully invited his generals, who were all his buddies, to a dinner in 959. When he arrived, he gave them all estates and wealth, causing them to retire to palaces. Sung thus continued to rule for a further 16 years, an achievement that was unprecedented at the time. But who are you expected to work with if you drive your buddies away? Although it may seem strange, the best course of action is to work together with your adversaries to increase your influence. Talleyrand, France's foreign minister, recognized in 1807 that Napoleon was losing control of the empire. Talleyrand attempted to remove him in light of this. But he required a trustworthy partner in order to carry out such a risky scheme. In the end, he surprisingly discovered the ideal candidate in Joseph Fouché, the head of the secret police, who had long been Talleyrand's political foe and the main opponent for Napoleon's favor. Nevertheless, the partnership was successful because both men thought Napoleon's time in power was over and that France required a new leader. Talleyrand therefore weakened Napoleon's diplomatic efforts with Russia, while Fouché collaborated with the English to weaken the emperor's position even further. When Napoleon was finally ousted, Talleyrand ascended to become a key minister in the new government, but Fouché lost his authority. Lesson 9. Instead of using logic, persuade people with artistic behavior. Have you ever engaged in a lengthy argument that lasted well into the night before one of you unwillingly conceded? The most obstinate among us find it simple to celebrate such occasions as wins, but beware, the reality is very different. In truth, trying to persuade others through argument is a complete waste of time and may even be harmful, particularly if they are influential. Roman consul Mucianus led an invasion force to take the Greek town of Pergamus in 131 BC. He needed to transform a large ship mast into a battering ram in order to destroy the city walls. The task's engineer, however, was aware that a smaller mast would perform better. He persuaded the troops to bring the smallest of the two as he explained his case. He was correct, a smaller mast would have been more effective. But it made no difference. For his trouble, the engineer was stripped and put to death by whipping. In other words, being correct and telling people they are wrong is insufficient. Better strategy is to manipulate others into accepting your point of view. With enough thinking, you can frequently find a method to support your position while giving your opponent the impression that you support them. Westminster once requested the services of renowned British architect Sir Christopher Wren to create a town hall. He wasn't, however, left to fend for himself. The mayor of Westminster insisted on 2 additional supporting columns being erected because he was afraid the structure may collapse and demolish his first-floor office. Wren was aware that the mayor's worries were unfounded. But he didn't say that, he just constructed the 2 columns. Years later, construction workers using a tall scaffold discovered that the columns ceased just before they reached the ceiling. Actually, they were doing absolutely nothing to support the construction. The pretty savvy Wren made sure that his point was established while avoiding a pointless discussion. In the end, the pillars were taken down. Lesson 10. Use someone's self-interest, not their goodwill, when asking for help. It's not simple to assume power, so if you want to succeed, you'll need to seek for assistance. But it matters how you ask. After all, you may merely request assistance from others out of goodwill. But doing so would be wrong. In the 14th century, Lucca was home to an Italian royal. With the assistance of the Paggios, a wealthy family, this prince became well known. But after he gained control, he abandoned the family and focused only on himself. This infuriated the Paggios, who then started plotting with other families to depose the prince. Before they did, however, Stefano Paggio of the Paggio family suggested that diplomatic means should be employed instead. Stefano went to the prince and told him about the uprising and urged him to take into account what the Paggios had done for him. When the prince learned of this, he brought the Paggios to his palace, but instead of repenting and giving the family a fitting reward, he had them all put to death, including Stefano. Simply said, expecting individuals to act morally frequently fails. Instead, make an appeal to their self-interest. But this can be challenging because most people are unable to look beyond their own self-interest in order to take other people's self-interest into account. Portuguese emissaries to Japan in the 16th century made a valiant effort to build rapport and win the Japanese over to Christianity. The plan didn't work. The Portuguese were too preoccupied with advancing their own religious agenda to recognize the actual interests of the Japanese, not because they were unwilling to appeal to the Japanese's self-interest. In contrast, the Dutch were shrewd enough to recognize similar interests when they arrived in Japan a century later. The Dutch were able to deliver on the Japanese demand for trade agreements that would give them access to the European market. As a result, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the Japanese emperor, abandoned the Portuguese and began interacting with the Dutch. Lesson 11. Being too available will turn people off. The secret to attractiveness is to hold back. Almost everyone who has tried dating has experienced some level of frustration with human nature. There is, after all, a basic rule of love: if your lover accepts your calls, you quickly get disinterested. If they ignore you, you become irrationally passionate. But it's not simply true of romantic love. Another fundamental law of power is that, although it may seem obvious, being too approachable will cause others to lose interest in you. People who opposed rulers and anybody with excessive power lived in the city of Media in what is now Iran in the 7th century BC. Chaos was, however, all but certain in the absence of a king. A guy by the name of Deioces promised to arbitrate between the conflicting parties and put an end to it. He was good at this, and people loved and admired him for it. But as he continued to arbitrate and settle conflicts, eventually people started to take his work for granted. Furthermore, they had no intention of granting him further authority because they continued to oppose the idea of a strong leader. Deioces was failing to apply a fundamental law of power, which states that in order to be desired, one must be unavailable. After all, people only realize how valuable you are when you vanish. Deioces soon understood this and realized that resigning was the only way he could get the respect he deserved. He left Media to revert to its prior anarchy as a result and moved to the countryside. The Medians immediately showed up at his door, pleading with him to rule over them once more. He accepted, but with one stipulation: a big palace should be built for him, guarded at all times by bodyguards. Following the populace's approval, he ruled the region for 53 years. Lesson 12. Surround yourself with individuals you rely on rather than isolating yourself out of fear. It's only normal for people to look for safety when they find themselves surrounded by other people, some of whom are clear foes. It can seem like the best option to construct a fortress to hide in during such times. But in reality, isolating oneself in this way also isolates you from power and influence, which is counterproductive. Without awareness of your surroundings, you cannot acquire any substantial strength. Take China in 220 BC as an example. In addition to being the emperor of China, Qi Shi Huangdi also held the title of most powerful man in history. But as his life wound down, he started to believe that he was the target of an attack. As a result, he withdrew to an opulent mansion that was shielded by a network of covert hallways that allowed him to walk from room to room without ever being seen. Anyone who even looked at the emperor would be put to death right away. The emperor only traveled alone, and when he did, he made every effort to disguise himself to avoid being recognized. He passed away during one of these outings, cut off from his friends and family and forgotten by his court. The solution is not seclusion. Instead, you need to surround yourself with those who will help you succeed. Louis XIV, who populated his Versailles castle with courtiers who were obligated to attend daily social events in his suite, stands in arguably the starkest contrast to Qi Shi Huangdi. Since losing the ability to rule and exploit vast territory without the king's permission, the aristocracy has been in uprising against the king's expanding power. Naturally, the aristocrats did not like these modifications. Louis put an end to the uprising by keeping the same nobleman under his close eye in his rooms, where he could employ his manipulative skills and cautious granting of privileges. In actuality, his courtiers fought for his favor and focus. Final thoughts. Power is a game that is played constantly and always has been. There is no way to opt out of the game, no matter how hard you try. Learning the rules and playing to your best ability are therefore your best bets. Power and conquest have always been the pillars of international government. Of course, a lot has changed in the current period, but power and control remain important. You can grow into a formidable opponent in the game of power by taking lessons from the successes and setbacks of previous power clashes. Using the link in the description box, you can purchase a copy of this book on Amazon.com. I appreciate your attention. Please remember to subscribe, like, and tell your family and friends about this video.